The early innovations in advanced statistics for football have clear inspirations, particularly from across the pond in America, where they were quicker to embrace the mathematical side of their favourite sports. Many of the obvious choices have already been taken in the initial rush to gain ground, but I believe that if you're willing to put in some effort and think outside of the box, then there are still stats that have the potential to cross the divide and recontextualize the way that we look at football. We'll be visiting 3 separate American sports for inspiration as we go, borrowing some unusual stats, transforming them, and theorizing about applying them towards football in some unexpected ways. Average separation is a stat in American football that tracks the space that a wide receiver can create versus opposition cornerbacks. A wide receiver's job is to catch the ball, and getting far away from the man covering him, his marker in footballing terms, is one of the most reliable ways to be a good player at the position. Using this average separation stat in American football can potentially help your scouts to diagnose some undervalued wide receivers who aren't getting big numbers in the basic stats like yards or touchdown catches, but they could still be doing their job perfectly and just not getting the ball for reasons outside of their control. On the surface, it's a bizarre choice to take out of a sport that is about as different to football as you can get. As fun as it would be to watch, you're not allowed to have some big men block for Bruno Fernandes as he sits back and waits for his attackers to run in circles until they're open enough for a pass. Despite that, I think it has the most direct application to analysing football out of anything I'll talk about today. Think about how you might see a team's effectiveness at set pieces ranked statistically currently. At the basic level, you might have a Sky Sports graphic showing the amount of goals each team has scored from corners over the past year. One step up from that might be the more statistically literate Twitter pages dividing that number by the amount of corners taken, or, even better, using the XG per corner for each team in the league to prevent goalkeeper howlers and incredible thundering headers from skewing the data too much. But there's still a lot of room for improvement. If you're looking at 2 teams, both of whom have had 10 corners this season, Team A has connected with a few contested, low-quality headers from near the penalty spot while creating nothing else of note. Team B has a set-piece routine that they've been practicing that has been working really well in training. In-game, their routine has succeeded in getting their most dangerous target man running free, uncontested, in a dangerous area on 3 or 4 separate occasions, but the delivery has just missed his head by a matter of inches each time. The commonly used best available stats would rate Team A as the more dangerous from set pieces at a glance, but the use of some kind of separation metric could add important context and create a clearer picture as to the reality of Team B being a lot more likely to score from set pieces in the future. But one of the most important aspects of applying any new stat to a sport is to think about the potential limitations and pitfalls involved in using it. To start with, it doesn't make sense to track every player's separation from a corner, because the space that this player, sitting 10 yards outside of the box has, is a lot less valuable than the 6'5" centre-back running into the near post. Tracking every player in the box doesn't even make sense, because a lot of these routines that try and get one player running free relies on a kind of blocking of sorts from the other players, and those players may often be the target from other dead ball situations. This is not a stat that you can blindly track for every player, adding up all of the numbers from each corner together, sorting indiscriminately from high to low, and going big number equals good. You'd ideally only be tracking separation from dead ball situations where you know the individual is one of the intended targets for the stat to be most effective. There's also the fact that a lot of corner routines don't rely upon getting separation from markers in order to be effective. There are set-piece routines that rely upon loading up on players at the near post, or crowding the keeper, and simply being more physical in order to get the pivotal touch. These routines will be unconcerned with separation creation because that was never the aim in the first place. So, You'd want to be taking these kind of dead ball situations out of your data set in order to increase the accuracy of the separation stat. That's why I think that this stat is probably best used by teams for self-scouting and analysis. For the plays that are schemed up, which rely upon getting a free runner, you can track the intended targets, their separation, and use that to compare it to your other routines more effectively. This becomes even more powerful when you combine it with other stats, giving you an incredibly useful piece of the puzzle in order to accurately assess the effectiveness of your set-piece routine playbook. This stat could also be invaluable for analysing the opposition for an upcoming game. For teams with the resources to be able to do this kind of analysis, it could be a big difference maker. Being able to look at the separation stats for your next opponent, then seeing that they're really bad at tracking numbers, even when it's not showing up in terms of goal scoring or XG metrics, could completely change your plans for set pieces for the upcoming game, giving you a massive edge in a part of the game that is more heavily scrutinized and strategized than ever before. Following on from that logically, I don't think it would be a very effective tool for statistically scouting players en masse in order to see how dangerous they are from set pieces. If you're a team with a massive scouting and data analysis budget, and you're genuinely looking for a tiebreaker between two centre-backs, I guess it could be worth your time. In all likelihood though, your time would be better spent elsewhere, like making sure your team doesn't sign Raheem Sterling in the year 2025. There were some other potential situations that I thought the stat could be useful, such as analysing the separation from crosses in open play to see how good players are at finding space in the box, but I'm not sure that you could draw any useful conclusions from such a challenging data set. Still, this set-piece separation gives an informative and actionable metric for any team to use, even if it's only applicable in a very specific set of circumstances. We'll be aiming for something a little more useful for analysing open play with our remaining candidates. All of the stats I'll be presenting are from a shortlist for a video I made a few months ago that went through many different iterations. Usage rate, a stat conceived to analyse basketball, was something that went on and off the shortlist repeatedly before I decided against it being useful. So why is it here? Well, I saw this in my feed about the usage rate stat and how it could be used in football. That video was what made me realise that a lot of the remaining items on the shortlist fell under this category of stats to steal. So I thought it was only fair to give it a shout out. It's a great video that outlines the stat and its potential uses better than I could, so give it a watch afterwards. I plan on making a standalone video of why I personally didn't like usage rates transition to football, but as a consolation prize, I thought I'd talk about another stat from the same sport that I have conflicted feelings on.
Oh my, someone called the National Weather Service. We had an unanticipated storm in the building tonight.
Gravity is a very easy stat to understand. It measures how closely each player is marked by a defender from the opposing team. In general, the higher the number, the more of a threat you are perceived to be with the ball in your hands, as teams are committing more resources towards stopping you. In an ideal world, transitioning this stat to football would let you numerically quantify the kind of extra attention that dangerous players receive. On the extreme end, you can think of teams attempting to man-mark Messi or Lamine Yamal to limit their impact. Even if those players who draw a man-marker don't score a goal, they will have created a lot of extra space for their teammates, which should positively impact the team. So why would this knowledge be valuable? Well, it could allow your scouting team to identify undervalued players who are extremely talented, but who receive so much extra attention that the more traditional metrics like goals, assists, XG, etc. don't show their full value to a team. These are players who could explode in those more traditional metrics if given more skillful teammates, forcing teams to spread out their defensive resources more evenly, giving them a chance to shine individually. Or will create very advantageous positions for their teammates if they continue to receive touch time marking. If you think about some of the big sports on a scale, at one end you have American football or baseball, sports that have incredibly repeatable, defined phases of play, And at the other extreme, you have sports like football or hockey that have incredibly fluid and complicated structures. Basketball, with a running clock and a freer structure, might give the impression of being quite similar to football, but in terms of statistical analysis, basketball is a lot closer to American football or baseball than to the other side of the scale. It's not as extreme as American football, as there's more player autonomy in the execution of those plans, and there are still turnovers and quick transitions. But if you took every possession in a game of basketball and compared them against each other, they are far more similar than if you did the same for a game of football. In basketball, every player on the court in the average possession is within shooting range. That makes a stat like gravity far more widely applicable to every player, as they need to be guarded to a relatively equal extent at all times. If you separate the players into two groups, those who play on the perimeter and those who play inside, then that's basically all of the delineation that you need in order to make the gravity stat work for every player in a relatively fair comparison. For football, to start with, the players are spread far further apart, many out of realistic shooting range, and all having vastly different levels of urgency for the defense to mark. So you'd only really be able to compare each individual position to each other. There's also the fact that the space given to each player on the pitch is heavily reliant upon the score of the game and the quality of each team in a way that doesn't apply to basketball, as you have a lot more options in terms of how much space you give the opposition, with the option of pressing high up the pitch or sitting deep on the edge of the box. So that would be another couple of sets of variables you need to keep a track of to accurately compare different players. If you get a large enough sample size, then you should still be able to get some info out of comparing players who have been in similar situations. You just might have to be very careful doing cross-league and cross-team comparisons without serious consideration for these differences. It's also so important to think about the reality of the sport that you're trying to apply a new statistic towards. Is it always a sign of a better player if they're being marked more tightly? Would a higher gravity number always be a desirable trait in a football player, even once you take into account everything we've already said? Sure, we have our earlier hypothetical examples of a player like Messi being man-marked, but what about this scenario? Who's harder to play against, Andy Carroll or Mbappe? Now, I hope you're all yelling Mbappe at the screen, Dora the Explorer style, like a good audience should be doing. As a centre-back though, you should probably be marking Andy Carroll a lot more tightly than you do Mbappe. How often do you see a defender getting too close to a pacey attacker and being spun in behind too easily off the ball, or easily turned with a nice little flick with the ball at their feet? Whereas the only threat that Carroll is going to offer will be aerial, and a tall centre-back shouldn't be worried about getting tight to him to prevent him from getting any free headers. In this case, Carroll's higher gravity number actually shows a massive flaw in his game. A bigger pitch, more players, more positions, I could go on and on. All of this added complexity in football, when compared to basketball, is also a big part of why I was so lukewarm about usage rate. It gets to the point where the data is getting so messy, the stat surrounded by so many qualifiers and asterisks, that it becomes less useful than the simpler ones that already exist. So why did gravity stay on my shortlist while usage rate didn't? Well, I think that it taps into one of the most underexplored areas when it comes to advanced stats that are available to the public. Any football fan knows that space is everything. Just look at how much of a buzzword the half spaces has become in the last 5 years in footballing circles. But what stats are there that even consider it? We've only just started getting stats that even acknowledge the value of advancing the ball up the pitch, like progressive passes, or the value of different areas of the pitch, like XG, XA, or XT. But there's absolutely nothing widely available that I can think of that deals with the space available to a player. But there's clearly a great interest in trying to statistically analyse the space available on the pitch, from the brainiacs at every single football club, is when you go digging into research papers or the Twitter pages of incredibly smart data analysts, some kind of space-related machine learning system is nearly always the first thing you'll see, accompanied by an insane mathematical formula that takes up half of a page and an image that looks like they took a bunch of acid and started playing with those old tangram toys that you used to get in school. So it's clear that a set of quantitative stats, which measures the space that a player has on the pitch in various situations, has the potential to provide a lot of value when looking at the sport. And I think that gravity could be one of those stats that could be a more approachable entry point, as long as you're wary of the potential pitfalls. That was a bit dense, wasn't it? Let's lighten the mood a bit. Baseball is the mecca of data analytics in sports. We all know the story of Moneyball, but that was far, far from the start of the statistical movement in baseball. So they've had plenty of time to develop all sorts of intricate and complicated stats. But one of my favorites to look at as a fan in the sport is incredibly simple: hard hit percentage. It does what it says on the tin. It's a simple measurement of how often the batter is able to smack the ball really, really hard, displayed as a percentage of their plate appearances. I've definitely seen little graphics pop up after a really well hit free kick with how hard players have hit the ball. So everything we need to make this stat already exists. Tell me you wouldn't love a way to statistically sort which players in the Premier League are best at absolutely mullering the ball really hard towards the goal. It's something I'd go and take a look at on Football Reference at least a couple of times a season, so I just need someone to make it happen. As to its usefulness, well, that's a different matter. You could maybe try to improve it by tracking hard hit shots that are also on target to try and create something similar to barrel percentage, a stat which combines how hard a ball is hit with its launch angle. But the power of a strike is just not as valuable in football as it is in baseball, given the strength of a coolly placed finish with the side of the foot or a dainty little chip in the right situation. For a more serious example of something that could be used to great effect, I'm actually going to be looking at a stat that deals with the least glamorous side of baseball: fielding, with outs above average, or OAA. In baseball, a fielder's goal is to catch the ball before it bounces in order to get the batter out. If you're familiar with cricket, it's the exact same principle there. What OAA does is it takes the probability of a player making an individual catch in a game. In this example, let's say it's 65%. If the player makes that catch, they'll be awarded a plus 0.35 score. If they fail to make that catch, then they'd be awarded a score of minus 0.65. You then keep track of each opportunity the player has over the course of the year, add up all of the results, and you've got one handy metric that gives you a very good idea of how good a player is at tracking down catches in the outfield. So the big question, how do we apply this to football? Well, it's important to understand how catch probability is calculated. In order to judge how likely a player is to make a catch, they use 4 key factors: how far the player needed to run, the time he had to get to the ball, the direction he had to run in, and whether or not the ball was close to the wall. Now, there's obviously not a scenario where football players have to run under moon balls and try to catch them, but with a bit of tweaking, I think that these could be an incredible set of criteria for judging a player's ability to hoover up loose balls on the football pitch. Imagine if we used these factors for our stat instead: how far the player needed to run to get the ball, how much time he had to go get the ball before an opposition player, what direction he had to run in, and whether or not there were any obstacles in the way, such as the referee or players from the opposition team. By using this criteria, you could give a minimum of one player from each team a likelihood of recovering every single loose ball in a game of football. Let's call it ball recoveries above average, or BRAH for short. Here's an example featuring one of the best in the game, Rodri. As these two players come together in a challenge and the ball squirts free, there are two players who have a realistic chance to react and win the loose ball. They are about equidistant to where the ball ends up, but Rodri gets to carry his momentum forward while the player in red has to turn around and push off at about a 90-degree angle. There's a chance he could have picked up the ball if he'd had really elite anticipation and spatial awareness, but my rough eye test percentages would give Rodri a 90% chance of getting this ball. So we'd add 0.1 to his BRAA, thus giving the player in red a 10% chance, which leads us to subtracting 0.1 from his BRAA. You'd obviously want to create a more accurate and automatic way of assigning these percentages than my eye test rankings, but it will do for this example. All you need to do is to continue to add and subtract these numbers throughout the course of the season for every single player. And you could have a really good idea for who has a penchant of nicking a ball away from the opposition when they shouldn't have. You can also keep track of the stat for any player with a statistically significant chance of winning the ball. So you could assign scores for 3, 4, or even 5 players for a ball that drops in the middle of a group who all have a chance of getting there. The main problems with this stat would be creating the infrastructure to actually track it, as it is a considerably more complicated matter than tracking one player to the exact landing spot of a ball in baseball. But I'm confident that it's the kind of stat that is absolutely feasible to make if you gave the right people enough time and money. Here's an example that I think really illustrates its potential value. Here, a defender makes a clearing header and Reece James easily beats out a 39-year-old Luka Modric to the ball and scoops it up. The eye test might fail to register it because he won the ball so cleanly, but Reece James winning this ball would not have been a sure thing against someone who was stronger defensively and quicker than Modric. You can see here, he's on his toes, reacts quicker, and obviously has better foot speed than Modric in order to get there cleanly and keep possession. Now, I can guess your next thought. Big deal. I don't need a number to know that Luka Modric is unlikely to be of any use in defence in the year 2025. But instead, imagine it's a defensive midfielder who's just turned 30. Your analysis team has noticed from their tracking data that his speed has decreased a bit, and you're worried that it might leave your defence exposed. But upon analysing this ball recovery metric, you realise that he's still positively impacting your defence by scooping up loose balls. His anticipation and reading of the game is still so good that it's enough to make up for his declining pace. Or if your team had a promising youngster who was a physical specimen, he has all of the speed, acceleration and strength that you look for, and the defense has been leaky when he plays. If the team noticed that his BRAA was low, they could look into the tape and see that he's often flat-footed and gets sucked towards the areas where challenges are occurring, rather than playing the space and the ball, giving a coaching point for him to work on in training. It's a number that could give you a potential insight towards traits that are normally very hard to show with any kind of statistic, like anticipation and the reading of the game. I think it could also be potentially a very useful statistic for judging goalkeepers and how good they are at coming outside of the box to stop through balls and sweep up behind the defence, as it has the potential to show which keepers make the right decisions while flagging those who are overly cautious and stay too close to home. One of the most important skills on the pitch is the ability to be a disruptor and win back possession for your team. While it's a skill that's possible to spot with the eye test, a stat like this scales incredibly well without much human input. If it's possible to create the infrastructure, it's so much more automatable when compared to something like the set piece separation stat that we were hypothesizing about earlier. Just imagine in a best case scenario where this kind of analysis could help your scouts find players like N'Golo Kante, a player who can seemingly cover the whole of the midfield by themselves from an undervalued transfer market. You'd be potentially saving your team's transfer budget tens of millions of pounds if it goes well. If you enjoyed, then please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel.